Mark had never been a particularly devout man. His wife, Laura, had always been the one to attend church every Sunday, a routine she cherished as part of her sense of purpose and belonging. Over the years, however, their marriage had grown distant, and the gap between them seemed to widen with each passing day. Their once vibrant conversations had dwindled to polite exchanges over dinner, and the passion they had shared in the early years had long since faded. Mark found solace in his work, throwing himself into his career in an attempt to escape the emptiness that had crept into his life. Laura, on the other hand, sought comfort in her faith, attending church more often and diving deeper into her religious practices. For a decade, this routine had been the backdrop of their lives. But as the years went by, Mark couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted. He felt more and more like a stranger in his own home. Laura, with her gentle manner and unwavering devotion to God, had become a distant figure in his eyes. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had changed, but he knew that something was missing. He missed the days when they had laughed together, when their touch was electric, when their conversations were full of possibility. Now, he was just going through the motions, and the weight of their stale marriage hung heavily in the air. It was during one of these church services that Mark's life would take a turn he hadn't anticipated. Laura had insisted that they attend, as she had done so many times before. She had been quiet in the car, as if preoccupied with something, but Mark didn't ask. He had stopped asking about her feelings long ago. They sat in the pews, the familiar smell of incense and the soothing sounds of hymns filling the air. Mark barely paid attention to the service, his mind wandered, thinking of the stack of paperwork waiting for him at the office and the deadlines that loomed on the horizon. That was when he first noticed her. At the front of the church, Sister Cecilia stood near the altar, her posture straight and dignified as she led the congregation in prayer. There was something about her that caught his eye. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, and despite her simple nun's habit, there was an undeniable grace about her. Her face, though framed by the modest veil, exuded a quiet kindness, a softness that seemed almost otherworldly in the sterile environment of the church. She moved with an elegance that made Mark's eyes linger a little longer than they should have. For a brief moment, their gazes met across the sanctuary. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it was enough for Mark to feel a jolt of something unfamiliar. His heartbeat quickened, and for a second, he felt a strange connection with this woman, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't explain. It wasn't lust, not exactly. It was more of a curiosity, a fascination. She was different from everyone else in the room, different from Laura, who seemed so lost in her faith, so immersed in her own world. Cecilia, on the other hand, seemed to stand apart, like someone who didn't quite belong, and yet, at the same time, belonged perfectly. After the service ended, Mark and Laura lingered in the back of the church, chatting with a few fellow parishioners. Mark, still distracted by the image of Sister Cecilia, glanced around and noticed her speaking with some of the older parishioners. Their conversation seemed warm, genuine. Cecilia smiled often, her laughter light and easy, as though she was at home in this place, a stark contrast to Mark's own sense of isolation. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to her. There was a quiet strength in her presence that unsettled him. When the crowd began to thin, he saw an opportunity to approach her. Laura, lost in conversation with a church member, didn't seem to notice as Mark walked toward the young nun. "Excuse me," Mark began, his voice betraying a slight hesitation as he approached her. Cecilia looked up, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel both self-conscious and captivated at once. "Hello," she said softly, her tone calm and inviting. "I'm Mark," he introduced himself, his hand outstretched. "My wife and I have been attending this church for a while now, but I don't think I've had the pleasure of properly meeting you." Sister Cecilia smiled, her lips curving into a gentle expression. "I'm Sister Cecilia," she replied, shaking his hand. "I've been here for a few months, helping with some of the church's community projects." They exchanged a few pleasantries about the church's activities and the state of the building, with Mark asking if she needed any assistance with the repairs. Cecilia mentioned that the church had been in need of some upkeep, and she had been coordinating a small group of volunteers to help with the renovations. As they spoke, Mark noticed how easy it was to talk to her. Her voice was soft, but it carried a warmth that made him feel at ease. There was no judgment in her gaze, no hidden motives, just a genuine interest in the conversation. It was something he hadn't realized he had been missing for a long time, genuine connection. The more they spoke, the more he found himself drawn to her. They shared stories about their lives, though neither one of them ventured too deeply into personal territory. Mark spoke briefly about his work, the pressures he faced, and how he often felt distant from his wife. Cecilia, in turn, mentioned her work with the church, though she didn't go into great detail. There was an underlying sadness in her voice, one that Mark couldn't quite place. It wasn't the kind of sadness that came from hardship, but rather the kind that seemed to emerge from the quiet spaces between words. Their brief exchange was enough to spark something in Mark. It was subtle, but unmistakable. As he walked back to Laura, who was still chatting with the parishioners, Mark couldn't help but glance over his shoulder at Cecilia one last time. She was speaking with another church member now, but for that brief moment, their eyes met once more, and Mark felt that same pull, a feeling that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that something had changed within him. He couldn't stop thinking about Sister Cecilia. It was as if she had opened a door in his mind, one that he hadn't even realized had been shut. And now, the questions began to form. Who was she really? What was it about her that captivated him so? And most importantly, what did it mean for the future of his already faltering marriage? The following Sunday, Mark found himself sitting next to Laura once again in the pews of the same church. The ritual had become a formality, something they both did out of habit rather than genuine connection. Laura's focus remained on the service, her eyes closed in prayer, her hands clasped tightly. But Mark's mind was elsewhere, distracted by a quiet, nagging thought that had taken root since his encounter with Sister Cecilia the week before. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that it was just a fleeting moment, a brief spark of curiosity that would fade with time. But it didn't fade. The more he tried to ignore it, the more he found himself thinking about her. Her gentle smile, the warmth in her eyes, the way she had made him feel as though his words mattered. It had been so long since anyone had made him feel that way, like he was seen, truly seen. After the service, Laura was engaged in a conversation with a fellow parishioner, and Mark saw his chance. He walked out of the church and glanced around the courtyard. It wasn't long before he spotted Sister Cecilia, standing near the church's small garden, speaking with a few of the older members of the congregation. She appeared relaxed, laughing softly at something one of them had said. There was a lightness to her, a joy that seemed to radiate from her, and it caught Mark's attention again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked toward her, trying to mask the flutter of nervousness in his chest. As he approached, Cecilia turned her head and caught sight of him, her face lighting up with that same warm smile that had captivated him the week before. "Mark," she said, her voice gentle and welcoming. "It's good to see you again." "Hello, Sister Cecilia," Mark replied, his voice sounding slightly less confident than he intended. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," she said, glancing at the small group of parishioners who were now leaving. "I was just talking to a few of the volunteers about the upcoming church projects. How are you?" "I'm good," Mark said, though it wasn't entirely true. He still felt restless, caught in a web of thoughts he wasn't sure how to untangle. "I've been meaning to ask, how's the work going on the church repairs? I know you've been overseeing a lot of it." Cecilia smiled and nodded. "It's coming along. Slowly but surely. It's a lot of work, but I enjoy it. There's something peaceful about it, you know? Just taking the time to care for something that's been here for so long." Mark looked at her, intrigued. There was a sincerity in her voice that resonated with him. He realized then that he had been feeling the same way, like something in his own life needed attention, needed care. But he wasn't sure how to go about fixing it. His marriage, his sense of self, everything felt as though it was crumbling under the weight of unspoken words and unmet needs. "I can't imagine how much effort goes into it," Mark said, trying to sound more engaged. "But it must be rewarding. I think that's something I've been missing in my own life, a sense of purpose, maybe." Cecilia studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. There was a softness in her expression now, as though she could see something more beneath the surface. "Purpose can be hard to find sometimes," she said quietly. "Especially when you're feeling disconnected from the things you used to care about." Mark felt an unexpected surge of connection in that moment. Her words seemed to echo his own feelings, as if she had read his mind. He felt a pang of vulnerability, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Here was a woman who seemed to understand the emotional void he was living in, and for the first time in a long while, he felt heard. "I think you're right," Mark said, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "I've been disconnected for a while. From everything. My marriage, my work. It's like I'm just going through the motions, you know?" Cecilia's eyes softened with empathy, and she nodded slowly. "I understand. Sometimes we get so caught up in what we think we're supposed to be doing that we forget what we really need." Mark stared at her, not sure how to respond. There was a heavy silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the unspoken words filled the space, creating a shared understanding that neither of them needed to explain further. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to unload on you," Mark said, realizing he had said more than he had intended. "I guess I just needed to talk to someone who might understand." "You don't have to apologize," Cecilia replied, her voice calm and reassuring. "Sometimes, talking is the only way to begin understanding what we're really feeling." Mark looked down at the ground for a moment, gathering his thoughts. There was something about her, something that made him feel safe enough to open up in a way he hadn't for years. But he knew that he shouldn't. She was a nun, and he was a married man. His feelings, whatever they were nothing more than fleeting impulses, nothing that should be acted upon. But despite the warning bells ringing in his head, he couldn't stop thinking about her. There was an undeniable pull between them, a connection that neither of them had asked for, but one that had somehow found its way into their lives. The more he spoke with her, the more Mark felt like he was stepping into dangerous territory. As their conversation wound down, Cecilia glanced at the church clock and smiled apologetically. "I should get back to the repairs. But it was really nice talking to you, Mark. I hope we can continue our conversation sometime." Mark nodded, though part of him didn't want the conversation to end. "I'd like that," he said quietly. As Cecilia turned to walk back toward the church, Mark stood there for a moment, watching her go. There was a weight in his chest, a mixture of guilt and longing. He knew that whatever had begun between them, whatever connection they shared, was fraught with complications. And yet, it didn't seem to matter. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt alive, truly alive. And it terrified him. One evening, as the church was preparing for a community event, Mark volunteered to help with some of the preparations. He hadn't planned on doing so, but it felt like the right thing to do. He needed something to occupy his mind, something to distract him from the increasingly overwhelming pull he felt towards Cecilia. And so, he found himself in the church hall, setting up tables and arranging chairs, when Cecilia appeared, looking as calm and composed as always. The following weeks unfolded with a strange sense of inevitability. Mark found himself returning to church, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stop thinking about Sister Cecilia. Every Sunday, he would sit in the same pew next to Laura, but his mind would inevitably wander. He would glance around the church, waiting for that brief moment when their eyes would meet, when he would catch a glimpse of her. And it always happened. Their glances, though brief, seemed to carry a weight. There was an understanding between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Laura, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware. She continued to attend services with her usual devotion, focusing on her faith, her prayers, and her church duties. It was clear that she was still searching for something Mark wasn't providing anymore. Their marriage had become a shadow of what it once was. They coexisted in the same space, but it felt as though they were living parallel lives, never truly connecting. "Mark," she greeted him with a warm smile. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I wasn't sure I was going to come," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I figured it was the least I could do." Cecilia nodded, her eyes kind, though there was something more in her gaze now, something deeper, as if she too could feel the weight of their connection. They had spoken many times in passing since their first conversation, but this time, there was an unspoken tension between them. It was as though the air had thickened with the growing awareness of what was happening between them, something that neither of them could quite name but both felt. "I'm glad you did," Cecilia said, her voice soft and measured. "I've been doing a lot of work with the community here, and it's been a rewarding experience. But sometimes it feels like there's too much to do, you know?" Mark nodded, though his mind wasn't on the conversation. He could feel the pull again, the desire to talk to her, to understand her more deeply. "I know what you mean," he said slowly. "I've been feeling disconnected. Like I'm just going through the motions. I don't even know what I'm working for anymore." Cecilia's eyes softened. "It's easy to get lost when you're not paying attention to what really matters. But you're here now, Mark. You're helping. That's something." Mark wanted to say more, to confess the internal turmoil he had been feeling for months, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the fear of what would happen if he truly spoke his mind. But the words bubbled to the surface anyway. "I don't know if I've ever felt like I was really helping anyone. Not in the way I should. Not in the way I need to." Cecilia paused, her gaze shifting slightly as she took in his words. Her expression softened further, as though she understood the weight of what he was saying. It wasn't just about the church, or the community work. It was about his marriage, his life, the emptiness he had been carrying with him for so long. "I think," she began slowly, "sometimes we need to confront the things we're avoiding. We can only heal if we face the hurt." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Her words seemed to pierce through the fog that had clouded his thoughts for so long. He didn't know how to respond, but before he could speak, she continued. "You know, Mark," Cecilia said quietly, "we all carry burdens. And sometimes, it's the things we least expect that help us lighten the load." There was something in her voice now, a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, but it was there. For a moment, Mark wondered if she, too, was carrying something. Something she hadn't spoken of, something that weighed on her heart as much as his own struggles weighed on his. "I can't help but feel like I'm failing," Mark admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "Failing at my marriage, failing at life. I don't even know who I am anymore, Cecilia." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and it felt like a dam breaking inside of him. He had never said this to anyone, certainly not to Laura. He had buried these thoughts, these doubts, for years, but now, with Cecilia standing before him, it felt as though they had no choice but to come out. Cecilia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his face. Then, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Sometimes, it's enough just to acknowledge the struggle. To let yourself feel what you're feeling." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling into his chest. There was something comforting about her presence, about the way she listened without judgment, without trying to fix him. For the first time in months, he felt like he wasn't alone. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect to find this kind of understanding here." Cecilia gave him a small smile, one that was filled with a quiet kind of sorrow. "Sometimes, it's in the most unexpected places that we find what we need." It was then that Mark realized how much he had come to rely on these conversations with Cecilia. Each time they spoke, he felt as though the distance between himself and the person he used to be grew wider. She had become a mirror, reflecting his own emotions back at him in ways he hadn't been able to see before. And with each passing interaction, the bond between them grew stronger, more intense. They found themselves sharing more personal details, speaking of their pasts, their fears, and their desires. Cecilia spoke of her life before she took her vows, how she had once dreamed of traveling and seeing the world, but had chosen the convent to find peace and purpose. Mark, in turn, opened up about his marriage to Laura, how they had once been deeply in love, but now, he wasn't sure where they stood anymore. As their emotional connection deepened, so did the unspoken tension between them. There was a charge in the air whenever they were together, a sense that something was about to change. Neither of them could deny it, though neither dared to voice it aloud. The attraction, the longing, was there, lingering just beneath the surface, and it threatened to unravel everything they had built. It was in these moments of vulnerability, these exchanges where they shared their darkest thoughts and feelings, that the boundaries between them began to blur. Neither one of them could remain unaffected by the growing pull they felt. What had started as an innocent connection was quickly turning into something far more complicated. But neither Mark nor Cecilia could stop it. And in their hearts, both knew that what they were about to face would change everything. Mark had tried to pull away, to stop the thoughts that consumed him whenever he was near her. He knew this was wrong. She was a nun, and he was a married man. There was no future for them, no place for these feelings. He told himself he was only experiencing an infatuation, that it was a passing phase, something he would get over once the storm passed. But every time he saw her, every time they spoke, the storm inside him only grew stronger. The rain had started to fall in the late afternoon, turning the skies a deep gray, and the air was thick with the promise of a storm. Mark had volunteered to help clean up after a church event that evening, though he had no real intention of staying. His mind was a swirl of emotions, an overwhelming mix of confusion, guilt, and longing. He had never been good at confronting his own feelings, but lately, they had been impossible to ignore. It had been weeks since he and Cecilia had started to speak more deeply, conversations that had moved from mundane topics to personal reflections. They had spent more time together, though it had always been in public spaces, under the watchful eyes of the congregation. They had kept their distance physically, but emotionally, they had drawn closer with each passing interaction. That evening, as the rain drummed against the church windows, Mark found himself alone in the small kitchen, cleaning dishes after the event. The warmth of the room contrasted with the chill outside, and he felt the familiar comfort of routine settling in. But then the door opened, and Cecilia stepped inside, her habit damp from the rain, her face flushed with the cold. She smiled when she saw him, though it was a soft, knowing smile, one that seemed to carry an unspoken understanding. "Mark," she greeted him, her voice gentle. "I didn't expect to find you here." "I wasn't planning on staying," Mark replied, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "But, well, the storm's a bit heavier than I thought. I figured I'd help out." Cecilia nodded, stepping farther into the room. She looked out the window for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she turned to face him, her eyes softer than usual, as though she, too, was wrestling with something inside. "Mark," she said slowly, her voice quieter now. "I've been thinking about our conversations, about everything we've shared. I feel," she paused, as if searching for the right words. "I feel a connection between us that I can't ignore." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her words were like a shock, both a relief and a warning. He had felt it too, but to hear it spoken out loud, to acknowledge it, made it all the more real. This wasn't just in his head. Cecilia felt it too. "I don't know what this is," she continued, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "But it's hard to deny that something is changing between us." Mark felt his heart race, a mix of excitement and fear churning inside him. He had known this moment was coming, had known that eventually, they would have to confront the feelings they had been tiptoeing around for weeks. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to do. "I've been feeling the same way," Mark confessed, his voice low. "I didn't want to admit it, but I can't deny it anymore. Every time I see you, every time we talk, it feels like something inside me is waking up, something I thought was dead a long time ago." Cecilia's eyes searched his face, her expression full of understanding and vulnerability. She stepped closer, and the air between them seemed to thicken. The space that had once seemed so vast between them now felt so small, so fragile. "I didn't want to feel this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain outside. "I took a vow. I chose this life. But being near you, Mark, it's like I can't breathe properly. I feel torn, like I'm breaking something inside of me, and yet, I don't know how to stop it." The guilt in her voice was palpable, and Mark's heart ached for her. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflict that was pulling her in two directions. She had dedicated her life to the church, to her vows, to a life of service and devotion. And yet here she was, standing in front of him, admitting that she felt something for him, something that could destroy everything she had worked for. "I never wanted to hurt you," Cecilia continued, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to drag you into this. But the more I try to push it away, the stronger it gets. And I don't know what to do anymore." Mark reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the world was shifting. It was as if everything he had been holding inside had finally found a release, and all the tension, all the guilt, all the unspoken emotions were flowing between them. He didn't know if this was right. He didn't know if they could ever make sense of what they were feeling. But in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. "I don't know what's happening, Cecilia," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't stop thinking about you. Every day, every moment. I've been numb for so long, and now, with you, I feel alive. But this can't be real. It can't be something we act on." Cecilia closed her eyes for a moment, as if weighing his words. She didn't move away, though, didn't pull her hand from his. Instead, she seemed to lean into the connection, as if drawing strength from it. "I don't know if I can stop it either," she admitted, her voice small but resolute. "But I know we're both bound by things much bigger than ourselves, our lives, our choices, our commitments. And I can't pretend that what we're feeling doesn't exist." But I also know that I have a responsibility, a duty, that I can't abandon. Mark's heart sank. He knew what she meant. This was forbidden, dangerous territory. What they were feeling, what was growing between them, was a betrayal of everything they had built in their lives, of their vows, of their relationships, of their own identities. The guilt was suffocating, but the temptation was just as overwhelming. They stood there, locked in a shared moment of vulnerability, each knowing the consequences of their feelings. They both knew what they would lose if they allowed themselves to go any further. And yet, in that brief, fragile space between them, neither of them could bring themselves to break the connection that had begun to shape their lives. "Maybe we should take a step back," Mark said, his voice strained, trying to push through the emotional fog. "Maybe we should end this before it gets worse. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt Laura." Cecilia nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Maybe that's what we need to do," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe this is a sign that we're both on the wrong path." But neither of them moved. They stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, their hands still touching, neither willing to let go. The rain outside continued to fall, drumming steadily against the windows, but in that small room, time seemed to stretch and bend, carrying them into a moment that neither of them could undo. The unspoken truth hung between them, they both knew they could never go back to the way things were. Their feelings had already changed everything.